We are excited to be joined by Dr. Joel Kahn today. Dr. Kahn is a practicing cardiologist and clinical professor of medicine at Wayne State University School of Medicine. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Michigan Medical School and is an undiscovered stand-up comedian. You're going to hear that today. Known as America's holistic heart doc, Dr. Kahn has authored many articles and medical book chapters. He's written articles on Mind Body Green, Thrive Global, and Reader's Digest, and has 5 books in publication, including The Whole Heart Solution, Dead Execs Don't Get Bonuses, and The Plant-Based Solution. He has regular appearances on Dr. Phil, The Doctors, and Fox 2 News. He also recently debated Chris Kresser about the evidence in support of plant-based diets on the Joe Rogan Experience, and has been featured with Larry King live in a recent Heart special. He also owns 2 health restaurants in Detroit and a food truck in Austin, Texas. Joel Kahn is a machine, and we're honored to call him a friend and have him on the Mastering Diabetes. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kahn.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and I'll try and avoid my stand-up comedy so we can get to some meaty topics about meat and other such.
Unintended. Okay, so here's your first question for you today. Recently you wrote an article in which you refer to low carbohydrate diets as being high coffin diets because there's ample scientific evidence to show that low carbohydrate diets actually increase your risk for premature death. However, many health professionals around the world are teaching people to actually increase their intake of low carbohydrate foods like meat, like cheese, like fish, like eggs, and vegetable oils, claiming that by doing so, it's actually the best way to quote unquote reverse diabetes. Now, people with diabetes around the world are confused. They don't know what to do. They read stuff on the internet about eating low carbohydrate diets, and then people like you come along and say, actually, there's a better way. So can you help our audience understand why you refer to low carbohydrate diets as high coffin diets?
Yeah. Thank you. And you know, this is really not a stand-up comedy topic. This is a serious topic of which I by no means am making data up, but there seems to be such a myopic focus on a very important thing. Can you lose weight with low carb diets? Can you lower your blood pressure? Can you lower your insulin? I won't say your insulin resistance, but can you lower some markers of dysglycemia, blood sugar control? Can you improve some of them? And it looks like some studies, because there are some short-term studies that would suggest that you can see some advantages by what are called biomarkers by adopting this very hot, very popular diet, like you say, very, very low carb intake. Certainly everybody agrees we're getting rid of cookies, cakes, donuts, and ice cream and the carbohydrate content that are from refined carbs and foods like that. But they're also eliminating entire swaths of healthy foods like legumes. Very often potatoes are out the window. And, there are some of these diets maintain some leafy greens to constitute 5 to maybe 10% of the calories that you could claim are carbohydrate. So why not be supportive when they've got some 1-year studies? There's no control arm. They're not randomized, but they've got some 1-year studies that suggest diabetes type 2 may respond to this and people lose weight. Well, number one, anytime you restrict calories, people will lose weight. Doesn't matter what the diet is. And these diets tend to be calorie-restricted diets in general. But really my concern is, present to the people that are in these trials, present to the people that are signing up for these programs online, and I'm talking specifically low-carb and usually high-fat diets. Some are both high-fat and high-protein, which I'll just divert. Dr. Walter Longo says the most dangerous diet you can embark upon is both a high-protein and high-animal fat diet. That combo is particularly bad. But, why don't they disclose the fact that there is large, concerning, published, peer-reviewed, high-quality science? No, there's not randomized science. You're not going to take 250,000 people, put half of them on a low-carb diet, half of them on a Okinawa, Loma Linda, Blue Zone diet. Never going to be done. We can't wait for that study. So, for example, in 2010, a Professor Noto reported on 272,000 people, characterized their diet. Those that reported their diet as low carb at a 30% higher risk of dying during the follow-up of that very large 250,000 patient study. That's concerning. Dr. Lee, L.I. at Harvard, took 4,000 people who had a heart attack, characterized their diet, part of the Harvard School of Public Health. Those who reported low-carb, high-fat diets had a significantly increased risk of dying after their heart attack and follow-up. Similar study from Sweden, similar study from Greece, similar study from other segments of the United States. In fact, there are overall, until just recently, 7 studies that encompass nearly 1 million subjects that in unanimity say the long-term consequence of a sustained low-carb, high-fat, and these are animal-based diets, is a consistent trend towards higher mortality. Now, this is classic arguments that go on. These are associations. They don't prove causation. Maybe people that eat low-carb diets don't wear their seatbelt. There may be people that are choosing the low-carb diet are sicker in the beginning, so their mortality is higher because they started the study period of these 7 studies in poor shape. But all these studies use a process called multivariate analysis and try and factor out who's got smoking, diabetes, blood pressure, and try and make the playing field a little bit more even. And they try and they do their best. Now, just recently, in the last 3 months, 2 more studies have come out. One by an author named Seidelman. It's called the ARIC study, A-R-I-C. This is a science paper published in the journal called Lancet. This is a 150-year-old English journal, maybe the second most prestigious place to publish a scientific article. And they had the same findings, both from a large meta-analysis, and then they studied several thousand people in follow-up. Same thing. Database described as a low-carb diet, there was an increased risk of death. And so there's a new piece of data. And finally, just recently, we have a national database in the United States, and more than 24,000 people were followed through about 12 years in the United States. And actually, they then extended the study to 450,000 people. The bottom line is those that characterize their diet with the lowest percentage of carbohydrate foods had a 30% increased risk of dying during the follow-up, a 50% increased risk of developing heart disease, my field, a 50% increased risk of developing brain diseases like stroke, and a 35% higher increase in developing cancer. So it's not surprising that the all-cause mortality was higher because each of these major causes of death were higher too. But so again, we have to say, what's the quality of the science? This is some of the best, researchers, publications, peer-reviewed. What's the size? Now there's more than 1 million people in these 9 studies that have been followed, and they're consistent. So I would say if you're having epilepsy as a child and you're not responding to drugs, and we pull out our ketogenic diet because there's nearly 100 years of experience, probably worth the risk. And we're dealing with children that are at lower risk of atherosclerotic heart disease and all. The side effects of treating children with low-carb diets, ketogenic diets, are well described in the literature. It's not like it's a magic panacea. It might work in about 1/3 of the kids, which is great, but they can have cardiac issues and bloating and constipation and GI problems. But when we're talking about you just want to get in better shape and look better, and Halle Berry and Hugh Jackman, and maybe the more serious issue, I'd like to control my type 2 diabetes better. This kind of data demands we should be doing these studies with low-carb diets in type 2 diabetic in a controlled setting, with a randomized group, with informed consent, with long-term follow-up, more than just a blood test biomarker. Let's look at arteries, whether they're carotid ultrasounds like I have hanging next to my grandma's oil painting there on the wall. There's a way to do carotid ultrasound so you know if you're developing plaque during a 6 or 12-month follow-up study. Do maybe more advanced. Let's do the right studies to see if we're we can induce weight loss in a lot of healthy and unhealthy ways, but are we inducing healthy arteries? Are we promoting serious trends towards early death? And that's not Debbie Downer, the sky's falling. It's literally the data that nobody wants to talk about in this steamroller of low carb, enthusiasm, really, frankly, some insanity, keto insanity.
Okay, so I think here's where people get confused is that, if they adopt a ketogenic diet or a paleo diet or some version of a low carbohydrate diet, they see immediate improvements in their blood glucose values. They get lower fasting blood glucose, lower post-meal blood glucose, lower A1C value. They might lose some weight. Their LDL cholesterol might drop initially, and they see a number of these biomarkers, like you suggested. They're moving in the right direction. They do this for 6 months. They do it for a year, and then at a certain point, their A1C drops into a non-diabetic range, and they say, hey, look, I reversed type 2 diabetes. I used to have it, but I don't have it any longer. True or false?
Yeah, so I don't know if this study's been done yet, and I don't know if I'm just mimicking the brilliance of you two guys. But the way I explain it to patients is type 2 diabetes is a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. For whatever reason, I can eat an apple and my blood sugar will go to a certain point, and if I eat an apple every day, my hemoglobin A1C will be at a certain level. But there are people that are intolerant of eating carbohydrates, so their blood sugar is going to go up much higher and longer after eating an apple or a bowl of oatmeal or a piece of bread. And if they repeatedly eat that carbohydrate, their hemoglobin A1C will up. But so it makes only sense if it's a disease of carbohydrate intolerance and you stop eating or suppress the amount of calories from carbohydrate, your numbers will improve. You teach and I teach my patients, have you actually reversed the underlying pathophysiology of insulin resistance? Or, if you're nut allergic and you don't get around nuts, you won't have a reaction. You haven't reversed the nut allergy. You've avoided the inciting agent. And, short term, that might be a good thing to do. But to believe that you've actually changed the underlying disease. So what I've not seen is take somebody with type 2 diabetes, follow a low-carb diet for 6 months, see biomarker improvement if it happens, then give them a 2-hour glucose tolerance test and see if they're now glucose tolerant or remain with clearer data for glucose intolerance, carbohydrate intolerance, do a HOMA study, another way of measuring insulin resistance. I'm not sure I've seen that done to follow up on this point. It might be important window dressing, and I'm not downplaying it, but it's still sort of window dressing when you can adopt a whole food plant-based diet and potentially achieve the same biomarker weight improvements and reverse the underlying problem of insulin resistance and lipotoxicity, a word everybody listening probably has heard before, but certainly should know about, maybe read about, Google about lipo, L-I-P-O toxicity, which is the basic underlying problem in type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, I think you actually just hit it on the head. I mean, we preach this same thing, and it's that if you're eating a diet that's high in fat and or high in protein, just like Walter Longo describes, can be detrimental in the long term, but in the short term, it leads you to believe that you are actually reversing the underlying disease pathology, when in reality, the moment you go eat a carbohydrate-rich meal, check your blood glucose 2 hours later, it's going to be very high, 200, 250, 300. The reason is because the underlying disease pathology of insulin resistance has not changed. In fact, it's gotten worse over the course of time. So until you solve that problem, it's never going to go away. So here's the next thing that people with diabetes tend to be quite confused about. The connection between saturated fat and cholesterol. It's very confusing because, on the Joe Rogan podcast that you were on in the last couple of months, you debated Chris Kresser. And the two of you had this long conversation about whether there's a connection between the saturated fat that you eat and your resultant blood cholesterol. And he, like many people in the sort of paleo and ketogenic world, categorically denied that eating more saturated fat increases your blood cholesterol level, even though there's over 60 years of evidence-based research, including something called the Hegseth equation, which you're a master of, that accurately describes how eating more saturated fat can significantly increase your blood cholesterol. So help our audience understand the connection between the two and why there's such a confusion.
Yeah. So I don't think there's any question, and I'll give you an interesting anecdote. I don't dislike Chris Kresser, but we're allowed to be honest about the science and his statements. I don't think there's any question that a diet higher in saturated fat will, on average in populations, raise your blood cholesterol. And I still believe the next step of the equation, which is the diet hard hypothesis, when your blood cholesterol goes up year after year after year, atherosclerosis is generally not an acute disease, it takes years to develop. to go from a heart artery that's perfectly clean to a heart artery that's causing you a stroke or a heart attack is generally not a 6-month process during the duration of the study. I don't think there's any question about it. So just to give you an anecdote, on a previous Joe Rogan show that Chris Kresser was on alone with Joe in 2017, he talked about the ketogenic diet and a low-carb, high-fat diet. He talked about how he will do it now and then, but he doesn't feel all that good on it. And he said, within a couple weeks, my LDLP, my LDL particle number, doubles from 1,100 to well over 2,000. I don't think I should stay around with an LDL particle number that high. So I go off of it and I go back to my diet, which he calls neovore, or some paleo version, because he's added back legumes, which is fine by me, but he added back dairy, which is not certainly the original plan of Boyd Eaton, MD, and Lorraine Cordain, PhD, to add back dairy into the diet. So, he's concerned. Okay, let's talk about that. We never got to that on the podcast. I put that on the social media afterwards. Even since our discussion 3.5, 4 weeks ago on Joe Rogan, a study was published last week, I believe, and it's interesting. It's not always, and I kept getting beat up about this, the newest science isn't always the best, but there's a 3-week trial in what's called a metabolic ward, very carefully controlled, that they put young, healthy subjects on a low-carb ketogenic diet, and within just 3 weeks, so high-fat diet, the average increase in LDL cholesterol was 44%. It varied from 5% to 107%. So your LDL cholesterol could be 150, and within 3 weeks, it could be 310. And I certainly wouldn't advise somebody to walk around with an LDL cholesterol of 310. It does display that there's quite a bit of variability individual to individual. 45% was the average. Some people call that hyper responders. Some of it might be related to whether you have a gene called ApoE4 or not. But most people aren't having that blood work. Most people aren't even doing their blood work. The last patient I saw today, before beaming on with you, just walked out the door and said, I'm sending my 36-year-old son. He's 2 years keto. He's never had blood work. I mean, I want to make sure he's not the 107% cholesterol responder, not just 3 weeks later. But if you take a broader perspective, and I mentioned this many times, and Kresser seemed not to know it, in 1997, there's a very well-known study by a guy named Clark, with an E at the end of Clark, and he looked at what are called metabolic ward studies. There's nothing more accurate than locking people in the National Institutes of Health, totally controlling what their breakfast, lunch, and dinner is. You can perfectly make it that it's low carb, high fat, low carb, whatever you want. And those 395 studies put together show this very strong relationship between the percentage of calories in your diet from animal fats and what your blood cholesterol will be. I mean, I don't think there's any question. Now, is everybody going to go up 45, 50, 100%? No. It'll vary, and your genetics are part of it, without a doubt. Your microbiome is part of it, without a doubt. So that's saturated fat, and that's the only topic we really talked about at length on Joe Rogan. We hardly touched the topic of dietary cholesterol, which is only in animal products, not in plant products. But the bottom line there is the new USDA guidelines don't say what milligram per day you should limit it to, but they did say as little dietary cholesterol as possible is the goal for health, which is basically translated to as little or no animal products as possible. And we know living a plant-based life, it is completely possible to have no dietary cholesterol and thrive. Dietary cholesterol is not an essential nutrient. Every cell in your body makes cholesterol, and it makes all the cholesterol you need for vitamin D and sex steroid hormones and the rest.
Okay, so you basically pretty much already answered the next question here, but are all animal-based diets high in cholesterol, and is there a relationship between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol?
So we started to get to talk about this on Joe Rogan, dietary cholesterol. We got a little diverted, and one of the important things is that it's the proportion in the diet of cholesterol to be concerned about versus saturated fat and dietary fat, of which cholesterol is just one. So one toothpick, everybody knows what a toothpick is, 100 milligrams. We talk about 2 eggs, 400 milligrams. Just all the dietary cholesterol you eat, even if you're eating animal products, is very often 4 or 5 toothpicks, 400, 500 milligrams. The amount of dietary fat many people are eating is 150 grams a day. So when we're talking about the importance of cutting back cholesterol, how much does cholesterol influence your blood cholesterol, your risk of heart disease? When we talk about overall animal dietary fat, you're talking about a very different amount in the diet and a very different concern. Now, that's one point. Number two, there clearly are thin, healthy people. Classic study was done of thin people in India that were fed very high animal fat diets in the 1960s. Their cholesterol went sky high. They put them back on their native diet with chana masala, lots of chickpeas. Their cholesterol went down. If you get thin people relatively naive to eating a lot of animal fat and particularly animal cholesterol, cholesterol will go up. The problem is we saturate those pathways, and most Americans are eating a sizable amount of dietary cholesterol through egg and cheese and meat. And when you do an experiment on that baseline and you institute a diet that adds some extra dietary cholesterol, you see no change, little change. So even the very famous Dr. Ansel Keys, PhD, in the 1970s said, that the role of dietary cholesterol is inconsistent and far less important than the nature of the other fats in the diet. Are you doing plant-based fats? Potentially, are you doing high amounts of animal fat? So saturated fat is really the target. Still, the USDA says that you should eat as little as possible because it's the company it keeps. That egg yolk may have 200 milligrams, 2 toothpicks of cholesterol, but it has a sizable amount of saturated fat. And the sausage and the bacon you're eating next to it is a giant load of saturated fat plus other potential nutrients of concern, the carnitine and the 5-MeO-GC and the nitrosamines and the rest. So, they usually go hand in hand. If you eat a diet free of animal products, you should have essentially no dietary cholesterol. You still have to be a bit concerned about dietary saturated fat in coconut oil, particularly palm oil, particularly avocados, olive oil. A little bit olive oil tends to be about 15% of the calories are from saturated fat. And if you're following a very high olive oil diet like Dr. Stephen Gundry, Plant Paradox teaches, you might end up with a lot of saturated fat in your diet. But it's pretty unusual on a plant-based diet.
Okay, so we're going on this cholesterol subject here a little bit more. You, as a cardiologist, see the firsthand effects of high cholesterol levels, in the hearts of your patients as well as in blood vessels, peripheral blood vessels and cardiac blood vessels. Can you explain to us if other organs are also affected by cholesterol intake? Is it only your heart and blood vessels, or does increased cholesterol affect your brain in any way, your liver, your kidneys, et cetera, et cetera?
And again, so the answer is, every part of the body has blood vessels supplying it. We spend most of our time as a cardiologist, and most of our time as the public, if you study the field, talking about blocked arteries to the heart, a little less blocked arteries to the brain and stroke. Of course, there are people that have blocked arteries to their kidneys, to their legs, amputation, to their sex organs, erectile dysfunction. But more and more, we're focusing on blood flow to the brain, a large vessel blood flow. You can check by an ultrasound, but really small little vessels and what that does to cognitive function and what that does potentially your future risk of developing dementia. And the risk factors for heart disease are pretty much the same overlapping risk factors for dementia, because small vessel microvascular blockages in the brain are at least part of the issue of cognitive loss, memory loss. The classic study is the Chicago Health and Aging study, where the risk factors with age and development of brain disease, dementia, overlap. The smoking, the elevated blood sugar, the blood pressure, and certainly your blood cholesterol level, which is related in part to which foods you eat, how much of them you eat, and their content of saturated fat calories and cholesterol calories. So yeah, it's and then there is a condition that's called, people probably are hearing a bit about it, fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver, non-alcoholic steatohepatosis. These are all fancy words. They're problematic in that, there's felt to be, and I hate, not everything's an epidemic, but people do talk about an epidemic of fatty liver due to our weight gain, due to our processed food intake, due to our high animal food intake. So foods rich in cholesterol, the chicken, the cheese, the red meat, the eggs, as part of often markers of an unhealthy diet and weight gain, will lead to liver disease in addition. And it can be very serious. That its statistics are already that the number one cause of cirrhosis, a very high risk for early death condition, is no longer alcohol. It's actually non-alcoholic fatty liver, which is reversible in its early stages by getting yourself over to a plant-strong or plant-only diet.
One thing people are very confused about is the claim that grass-fed animal products are much better than conventionally processed animal products. Is this true?
Yeah, so I'm a free-range grass-fed human, because that would be a good way to describe it. Thank goodness. I'm not caged up too much, and I'm basically eating grass-like substances a lot. So there's very sparse data. I will say this, there is data that if you can actually find wild game, I'm not endorsing hunting, there's a lot of reasons, and the best estimates are maybe 1% of the US population is sourcing their meats from really wild game that they hunt primarily. That the saturated fat content of a sheep on a ledge in Wyoming, maybe 1/8 that of typical store-bought red meat. And if we ever did a study, maybe we'd find long-term there's less health risk to eating that game. The reality is it's so obscure, it's not translatable to a large swath of people. There's still all kinds of issues of diluting populations of animals and changing eco-balance everywhere in the world, and the elimination of whole populations left and right. That it's not a solution. And that's one aspect, saturated fat or wild game. There's a little data that there's a bit more omega-3 in grass-fed beef. If you're really going to source, I mentioned this on the show, the other aspect is, people think I eat meat and I'm getting my B12. There's actually very little B12 in factory farm beef, because it's coming from animals that are, number one, eating dirt. And if you're living inside a warehouse, you're not going to eat much dirt. Plus, there's so much pesticide in a factory farm beef, which is 95+% of the red meat eaten by the American public, the white meat. There's so much antibiotic around being given that the bacteria are died. So they actually 90% of all the B12 in the United States that's actually given is given to factory farm production of animals for red meat and white meat, so that the public can get B12 from a piece of steak and such. So there's all kinds of problems. And somebody said to me, I hope you don't mind this analogy, if you really think you should get B12 filtered through a cow, why don't you just feed your dog coffee and kill your cow and eat the meat and get your caffeine through your dog? I mean, it's that inefficient, bizarre, and distorted idea that that the most appealing way to get B12 is filtered through an animal before it's sacrificed, or that you should get omega-3 filtered through a grass-fed animal. And the last part, just shut it down, is on that topic is, any projection that's being done, and what's really cool, and you and I aren't asking Oxford University, the United Nations, World Health Organization to do these massive analyses on farming practices and sustaining the earth and feeding our growing population. But they've all concluded that plant diets are necessary, that it's unsustainable to talk about grass-fed populations and free-range populations, as a better farming practice of healthier meats for the U.S. population or the world population. It's not possible, right? I mean, you need, I think 2.7 Earths to sustain the U.S. population or the world population if we switched over to grass-fed beef, because we're actually going to have to expand our use of forests and our use of land. So it's just terribly inefficient. And really, the number of studies are very tiny using grass-fed and Wagyu, Australian kangaroo meats and all. I mean, they're feeding such a tiny portion of the population. I think that it's an irrelevant, confusionary and obstructionist kind of point that people throw up.
I love that analogy you just made about the filtering and getting it, through that process. It could apply to fish as well. People are going to get my EPA and DHA through the fish instead of just learning how to optimize your body's own conversion.
Right. You want your dog meat caffeinated or not caffeinated? I mean, why not? I mean, really, we get so ingrained with certain conceptions. I mean, it's the same thing. We're just not used to thinking about that. But we're thinking about grass-fed beef for omega-3. We're thinking about meat in general for B12. It's horribly inefficient and bizarre that, we're taking B12, you can do steak, we got to give it to an animal so you can get it associated with saturated fat, cholesterol, antibiotics, pesticides, and inflammatory portions that are in meats in general.
Okay, so you are very well versed in the fasting mimicking diet by Dr. Walter Longo from USC. You talk openly about the benefits of periodic intermittent fasting. So can you talk to us about the evidence that it's possible to promote the birth of new beta cells through the fasting mimicking diet?
Yeah, and certainly there's, I'm not Dr. Longo, but I've now had a chance to be around him enough. He's very cautious in his words and his writing. And so the data was, you damage the pancreas of mice with an agent called streptozotocin. You then put them on an animal equivalent of reduced calorie, low protein, low glucose diets. And they demonstrated regeneration of some of the beta cells in the pancreas of mice in that model, because it is known that what he has trademarked and patented as the fasting mimicking diet does promote a release of stem cells, regenerative stem cell release on the 5th day, on the 6th day, at least in the human model. He would never say, that's ready for prime time. He never recommends the fasting mimicking diet as he has created and patented for type 1 diabetics. He's very cautious with many restrictions about its use in type 2 diabetics, or the 1.5s, because, it's 800 calories of very low sugar foods for 5 days, and you can clearly crash. There haven't been many problems because the advice from any medical advisor in the company or physicians like me that are experienced is it's a great program, but right now I wouldn't use it. I mean, if you're a nice portly pre-diabetic on nothing or a baby dose of metformin, I probably will encourage you to do it. So, with all that in mind, it's future work, it's future hope, but it's going to take a lot of trials and a lot of research, and don't do it unless you're in a research trial from University of Southern California or some similar institution as a type 1 diabetic. We have no reason to know if it's actually going to work in humans, and we have no database to say. But what I love about the fasting mimicking diet is we have an overabundance of calories, we're overnourished. Since 2011, the bigger health risk on a worldwide basis is overnourishment, not undernourishment. There's still, unfortunately, plenty of starving people, but not in the Western world. It's quite the opposite. And we have this ability to regenerate and stem cell-based regeneration. We just stop eating once in a while, and we have the health to just stop eating once in a while. And he's just created a program where you don't have to completely stop eating and do a water fast. You can eat 800 calories a day of soups and nut bars and olives, and because of their low protein, low glucose content, you get the same biochemical and physiologic response as a complete fast. So, the published data is on day 5, day 6, you can document very low IGF-1, you can document stem cell release, and if you do that repeatedly, you have the potential to regenerate. So the other animal models suggest multiple sclerosis, there may be regeneration of some of the damage to neurons in multiple sclerosis. That's crazy. That's animal model. There's a little human data that suggests symptoms go down in multiple sclerosis, but there's ongoing studies. There's this combining the fasting mimicking diet with a little variation, it's even lower calorie, with chemotherapy, that if you starve the body during chemotherapy, healthy cells go into a protective mode that they are less exposed and less metabolically active to take up the toxic chemotherapy agent, whereas the cancer cells just keep multiplying in an unregulated way. So actually be more success with chemotherapy combined with a fasting mimicking diet. And there's again been human studies showing side effects of chemotherapy go down, but there's many ongoing studies to see if actually cancer therapy itself and the long-term hope that cancer-free survival will be enhanced using this Nutra technology. Very cool stuff. The last major study was February 2017, but a lot of interesting data has been obtained. It just hasn't been published yet. There's a couple patents have been filed for the impact of Dr. Longo's program on the microbiome. And what I love, and these amazing changes in 5 days in the microbiome that never really were anticipated. So they're revving up some trials of the program with colitis and Crohn's and inflammatory bowel disease. What I like about it, just take the science away, Many of my patients, number one, have never gone 5 days and actually been mindful about what they eat. Many of my patients have never gone 5 days and eaten 1,000 calories a day or less 5 days in a row. Many of my patients have never done 5 days of plant-based foods, of which this is a plant-based program. There is some honey, but there is no traditional animal product. And it really introduces them to mindfulness, to calorie consciousness, and to plant-based eating. And since, the published data by my own experience, 80–90% of people really enjoy this experience. A little hangry. I get emails from patients. I can't believe how mental clarity, light, energetic. I'm doing it again next month. Pretty amazing stuff. And it helps me get them more plant-based, if not completely, because they survived and they didn't have a hamburger, hot dog withdrawal syndrome or such a thing. Although there is a junk food withdrawal syndrome that psychologically has been described in the literature lately, but they survived it and they'll keep going eating more plant-based.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually how a lot of people who perform intermittent fasting, even if it's a single 24-hour intermittent fast or 2-3 days, as much as 5 days, a lot of people report back to us the same thing they report back to you, which is that, oh my God, I feel fantastic. I'm not hungry. I don't feel like I'm constantly being driven to eat more food. In fact, I actually prefer not eating food. And that's something that I never anticipated would actually happen. But I hear this message over and over and over again from people, like you say, who are in this overnutrition state, who are chemically overfed with calories for 10, 20, 30 years at a time.
Yeah, it's really true. And it's interesting. The last few months, I give a lot of public lectures about optimal health or how to live to a healthy 100 or some such, exciting topic. I hope exciting. I actually begin with, in the nutrition part, let's first talk about what all health experts agree. We can all, and I show an empty plate, and I talk about why. I don't care if you're coming from a bad diet or a Mediterranean diet or a DASH diet or a paleo background or keto background. The empty plate has become a central rallying area that we can all talk about. Then let's go and talk about what's the optimal diet for what are you looking for? You're looking for weight control, you're looking for longevity, you're looking for compassion to animals and the environment, but the empty plate as an entry point is I can hold hands with some people I wouldn't normally hold hands with, like going on a low carb podcast I've been on, or I just did Sean Baker, the carnivore orthopedic surgeon. I just recorded his podcast. It'll be out next week. We actually had a fascinating 90-minute bromance. We got along oddly well.
I can't wait to hear that. That sounds great. One other sort of, I guess, a little bit nitpicky question that I have here for you is that there's a lot of people who transition to a low-fat, plant-based, whole food diet based off of the advice of you or any number of other educators in this field. And they drop their A1C, they drop their cholesterol, their total cholesterol, their LDL comes down, they lose weight, they drop their fasting blood glucose, they feel like $1 million. Except a lot of people come back and they say, hey, why has my triglyceride value gone up? It started at 123, and now my triglyceride is at 372. It's alarming. Have you seen this before? And if so, what's the reason that's happening in the first place? And what can people do about that if they do find the triglyceride is increasing?
Well, so if you ask me, it is an observation. It's an observation if you go back almost 30 years from Dr. Dean Ornish's randomized studies that HDL might drop a little bit and triglycerides might bump a little bit, usually not to 300, but they might bump. People can be distressed by that. The beauty of Dr. Ornish's observation is it was simultaneous with showing that atherosclerosis was reversing. And there is a theory your HDL might drop because you don't need it as abundant and active because your coronary arteries are healing and reversing, at least in his studies, and we hope in many other people. That doesn't really answer the triglyceride question. So the observation goes back at least that far, if not farther. But the reassurance from Dr. Ornish's studies is, what do you want, clean arteries or a perfect triglyceride level? I'd pick the clean arteries and not worry too much about the lab test. The second answer is I have the luxury in a pretty upscale advanced cardiac prevention clinic. All my patients have a blood level on omega-3. And I just it's prevalent everywhere, whether you're an omnivore, whether you're a junky plant food eater, which is a bad place to be, whether you're eating a really clean whole food plant-based diet. Many people are low in omega-3, and we know it's a blood test, and it's pretty widely available, but it's rarely done. And we know the importance of adequate omega-3, DHA, EPA, essential fatty acids for brain health and cell membrane health and lipid management, probably, favorable impact on blood glucose control. But on triglyceride content, it's critically important. There are prescription drugs, of course, that lower triglyceride through using fish-based oil. So I'm a zealot here about, chia seed, flaxseed, a couple tablespoons a day of ground flaxseed in most people. Most of my patients are taking 300 to 500 milligrams a day of algae-based EPA, DHA, and the triglycerides are fine. So either they were abnormal and I corrected them, or I corrected them via a serious focus on omega-3 supplementation. I think it's, if you don't check, you don't know. And the data is pretty strong that the blood level of omega-3 it's called a predictive biomarker, actually, of survival. It's very good data. Doc Greger did a video on brain health and an omega-3 level of 4.5% and higher in your blood. Normal is 5.5, but you just don't want to dip real low. So either ask your doc for a blood test on your omega-3 level, or you can actually find one of these online companies, just pay, get a doc, or just pound down ground flaxseed, pound down some leafy greens. If you're eating nuts, make sure the walnuts, which is insanely higher in plant-based omega-3 precursor compared to almonds and other nuts.
This is great information coming from somebody like you who has so much experience working with patients. And we say the same thing to our clients: get tested, know the number, and be smart about how to handle that. Right. Especially because people are concerned. We teach a low-fat diet here, low-fat plant-based whole food diet, and people are concerned about that. So getting test is the first place to start, and then optimizing the chia seeds, the flax seeds, stuff like that, and taking a supplement if you need it. It's no problem.
That's what I think too. No big deal.
Well, thank you so much for being here today with us. We really appreciate your time.
Well, I am a big fan, as you know, and I'll be out in LA November 9th, 10th, or in January and December. Maybe we can hook up and visit the WeHo Farmers Market, okay?
Looking forward to it.
You the man. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kahn. I always appreciate listening to your perspective and talk about a bromance. I'm silently stalking you as your career continues to explode, and as you get on more and more podcasts and more TV shows and more more articles on large publications. So continue the good work. You're killing it. I really appreciate your hard work.
Have a good day, guys.
You too.